Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening at the Mark Twain Library virtual edition for another installment of our Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy series, presented by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library. I'm Erin Dumeyer, the director of the library. In a moment, I'm going to let tonight's moderator introduce our guest speaker, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit about our award-winning conversation series, and also a bit about how to participate in tonight's program. Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy is a series of lectures and events created by the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters. Winner of the 2022 Connecticut Library Association's Award for Excellence in Public Library Service, this series began in the fall of 2019 to continue the community conversation on issues of race, justice, and democracy. Just a quick thank you to area libraries and leagues for their support of this series. Easton Public Library, Weston Public Library, Friends of the Weston Public Library, Newtown's C.H. Booth Library, Richfield Library, the League of Women Voters of Weston, the League of Women Voters of Richfield, and the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County. We are recording tonight's program, so the recording will be available later to view on the library's YouTube channel. We have set aside time for questions at the end of the program, and you are welcome to submit your questions in the Q&A function at any time. We'll try to get to as many as possible tonight. We are also offering closed captioning. The buttons for both the Q&A and closed caption functions are located at the bottom of your screen. Last but certainly not least, signed copies of Derek Black's book, The Klansman's Son, will be available for purchase at Bird's Books in Bethel. The books will arrive at the store within the next couple weeks, so call now and please reserve your copy. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our host for tonight's program. Dr. Daniel W. Barrett is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University and a member of the Conversations Committee. A resident of Reading, he graduated with a BA from Wesleyan University, earned his PhD in social psychology from Arizona State University, and served as a postdoctoral research fellow in health communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Barrett?
Thank you, Erin. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another event in our series of conversations on truth, myth, and democracy. I want to start by thanking the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters, of which I am a proud board member, for organizing tonight's event. So tonight, I'm very excited to have the opportunity to chat with our Derek Black. Derek is the author of the book, The Klansman's Son, My Journey from White Nationalism to Anti-Racism, which was published just about a week ago, actually, very, very hot off the press. And most folks haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I hope we'll be able to read it very soon. Derek uses they them pronouns and is a doctoral candidate in history at the University of Chicago. Since 2016, they've spoken to many audiences at universities, foundations, institutions, museums, synagogues, and churches. They received the Eli Wiesel Award, and a humanitarian award from the Anti-Defamation League. The Klansman's Son is Derek's first book. So Derek, thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight. I imagine that with your book just being published, you're very busy with interviews and traveling and so forth. So again, thanks for finding time for us tonight. Your book.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been actually an event and a community I've been wanting to participate with for a while. I was really glad it worked out now.
Oh, that's very nice to hear. Thank you. So your book and your story are a really good fit for this series on truth, myth, democracy, in part because you reveal some deep-seated truths about the white nationalist movement in this country, how powerful it is, what its sources are, and how influential it is. And many Americans don't realize the central role it plays actually in politics in today's America, unfortunately. And such that story, of course, is your own personal journey, from being the heir apparent to the white nationalist movement in the U.S. to becoming a very vocal and harsh critic of it. I'm looking forward to chatting with you tonight. Derek, so I have a series of questions for you to get us going, and probably more questions we have time for. And when we get to 8:30 or so, we'll start with some audience questions, at that point. So the first one. So in addition to reading your memoir, I read Eli Saslow's 2018 book, about you, Rising Out of Hatred, The Awakening of a Former White Nationalist. Also a very good book, as is yours, of course. The books are very similar, in many ways, not surprisingly. They tell essentially the same story of you and the overall movement. Perhaps oddly, I experienced them both as thrillers in a sense. As I was following your journey, I was anxious to get to the next step, like what's going to happen next and next and next. I knew the outcome. I knew where you ended up, but I really want to know how you got from A to Z essentially. And so I kept turning the page saying, when's the next revelation going to be? When's the next slight change going to be? And it was fascinating to read. Even after I read your book, I read Eli's book, Saslow's book, and I still had the same anxious, like, want to know what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. So fascinating story. I was looking for some kind of an aha ending or aha moment where you say, now I'm going to totally and completely separate myself from the white nationalist movement. And that didn't happen, as you know, obviously, and as is in both the readings. I'm going to ask you about that in a moment. But before I do, I want to ask you to summarize a little bit your involvement with the white nationalist movement. So many of our audience members may not know your story. So if you wouldn't mind just giving us an encapsulated version of your pre-collegiate interactions and role in the white nationalist movement.
Yeah, I guess I'd only open starting by that's something I've been asked a lot. If there was the two questions I think I get the most are, was there an aha moment in this process of leaving white nationalism and condemning it, and how do we replicate it? How do what's the secret to people changing their minds? And I think both of those are far more ambiguous and complicated and challenging than I think most people have ever wanted them to be. But I also think there's a lot of very clear answers that sort of come out of my experience. And I always try to emphasize that. I think my answer to the aha moment is the moment I could say I firmly condemned my family and was no longer a part of that movement was when I announced that I was doing so. I think that's something that's like a conundrum to me, that identity is the moment we say our identity. There's a long lead up to that, but it's the acceptance of it that really makes it significant. And so to answer your question, I grew up within a movement where there was never a moment that I didn't realize that my family represented an ideology that was considered marginal and treated as very extreme by the mainstream. But at the same time, they were a part of this broad movement that what they called white nationalism, or I think some researchers like to call it white power, to distinguish it from patriotism or Americanism or something. And they had been a part of it for decades by the time I was born, and they were within the world of it that considered themselves a little bit more genteel, a little bit more focused on politics, and they were convinced that it was possible for their movement to have a mainstream breakthrough and to win national and regional elections. And my essentially godfather, it's not really exactly the right term, I grew up calling him uncle, was David Duke. And he was my sister's dad and my mom's first husband. And both of my parents had joined in this nascent white nationalist movement in the 1960s when they were all teenagers or in college. And I was born relatively late in their life. And by that point, they had formed a Ku Klux Klan organization. They had joined a Nazi group and left a Nazi group. They had left the Ku Klux Klan organization that they founded because not because their ideology changed, but because they saw it as a bad brand and as a bad image, and they wanted to shed the connotation of violence that fell on them every time they used that word. And by the time that I was born, they were purveyors of the first white power website. My dad had founded Stormfront, the first white nationalist community online. And I watched it as I was a little kid in South Florida growing and coalescing this movement that had already existed for decades across the world, not just in the United States, but in Europe and Australia and South America. And seeing these people connecting through a server on his desk and watching it grow until there were tens of thousands of people who joined every day. And I guess my only final point is I watched that growing up, saw him giving interviews, and I gave my first interview. I asked to join him and feel like a part of my family and a part of this community by giving my first interview advocating for that ideology when I was 10 years old. And
I
that
saw a
set
piece.
me on this path that
Sorry,
felt concrete.
I saw a piece of that. I didn't mean to cut you off. I saw a piece of that. It was very quite fascinating to see that. Go ahead.
No, that's about it. Like that is this feeling of being within a world within the world, like feeling like an outsider, but also not necessarily growing up in a way that was like rural or isolated exactly. I grew up in South Florida, but my family felt like they were a part of something that wasn't a part of this society and country, that was a little bit outside of it. And it was their own members who were really their community.
Mhm. So you did 2 years in community college where you're living at home, I believe, right? And then you went to the New College of Florida, which was a very well-known bastion of liberalism, almost radical liberalism, really very left-leaning in so many ways. And I believe your father was quite certain you would be unchanged when you left there, a couple years later, and maybe you were as well. Can you tell us about what happened when you got to college? I know you were hiding your white nationalist background while you were there, and then it came out. People found out about it, and then lots of things happened on campus as a result of that. And your transformation seemed to start at that point, at least publicly.
Mhm.
So can you talk to us about what happened while you were at the new college, and maybe a little
Mhm.
bit about Allison and Matthew, your friends, and your Friday Shabbat dinners, and the roles all those played in your gradual transformation?
Mhm. That I showed up at New College thinking that I could do the same sort of splitting myself that I had done throughout my teenage years. And I had been in public schools only up until I was 9 years old, and then my family took me out of school, and I was homeschooled from that point on, from 9 to 19 when I went to community college, and then a couple of years later when I went to New College. And it was isolated. It was physically certainly isolated, but I also still engaged with people, still went out into the world and tried to form relationships, and always tried to see myself as someone who could be close and wanted to never foreclose an opportunity to form a relationship with someone just because of this ideology that my family had taught me. And that was in conflict, but I never really had to resolve it up until that point in college, with the fact that I firmly believed that my family were correct. I had grown up going to these conferences where tenured faculty would argue about the reality of race as this biological thing. And these days I can look back and think it's just remarkable that something that's so patently disproven is something that smart people could convince themselves and use like 19th century reasoning to justify. But at that point, I had thought, oh, I have all these facts, I have statistics, I have all these like arguments for this racist and anti Semitic movement on my side. And I also felt like I was responsible and wanted to be cared for and to care for this community. And so I had run for office. I had formed an internet radio network that ran 24 hours a day as a teenager. I had won that office. I had developed all of this local and national celebrity for doing so. I was really, by the time I went to college, taking on this identity that the white nationalist movement saw me as an upcoming leader, as somebody who they sort of trusted to make decisions and to find a way forward. And I didn't see that as something that I wanted to allow to completely take over my life. I viewed when I first got to college as this opportunity to try to spend a few more years prolonging before I actually had to embrace that identity. And so, like you said, when I showed up that first semester, I did not talk about my background. I thought that, like a lot of my teenage situations, when people would find out about it, that they would just sort of let it slide, maybe, which is what had genuinely happened. I had tried to split myself in two throughout my life. And I realized quite rapidly that this was a community that was deeply committed to social justice and anti-racism and really interrogated their thoughts. And this was not a space that, when they found out my background, was going to let it pass or was going to consider it something that could just be ignored. And so as I developed those relationships that first semester, I knew that I what had started as just, why would I bring this up, had become something that I was clear I was betraying them. Once people learned what I was keeping from them, they were going to feel like I had wronged them, and it became this massive pressure for me that I was calling into this radio show in the morning and then spending my days among this community, being very close to people who were Jewish or students of color, and feeling like I cannot resolve this feeling of being somebody who's doing this to people who I deeply care about. It's like that first semester took me by surprise, in the sense that I had not recognized the ways that I had been able to keep myself separate from people, and had not experienced the depth of relationships and the sort of complexity that happened when those relationships became so deep that I needed to resolve them. I needed to understand how I could advocate for my family's community and feel like it was correct, and claim that I wasn't harming people who I saw every day and had a lot of trouble arguing why it wasn't harmful to them. Yeah.
Yeah, it was fascinating. You left a magazine, I think was in the locker room, that had a picture of you officers on the cover, in your white nationalist, context. And so you were sort of hoping before you went away to Germany for a semester that somebody would discover that and figure out who you were. So clearly this dilemma you were facing, you wanted to resolve it in some way. This was one way to kind of force the issue, right?
Yeah, I was very avoidant. Like, I just did not know how to talk about it with people, and I also couldn't. It had become unbearable. It had become this experience that I cannot keep this from people and claim to be this good friend to them, and I just didn't know how to bring it up. I didn't know how to talk about it. And so, yeah, I did. I hid this magazine that was one of these articles about me that people would instantly recognize. And then I was studying abroad for the second semester, and a student, maybe somebody had found it in the gym, maybe they found it some other way. A student posted that magazine on the student email forum, where every member of the community, it only had 800 students, could see it. And so I was sitting in Germany reading this and watching all of those relationships I'd formed just implode, and sort of reckon with the fact that I had no explanation. I had no way to have it both ways or resolve it. But I also didn't feel like I could just condemn my beliefs. I believe, oh, this is something that I thought was defended by facts and a worldview. And that feeling of conflict and betrayal was something that I was going to be coming back to a campus that was debating what to do about me. But I already felt like I was a member, and I was always already being recognized as a member of this community, and I cared about them. And so it coming back, it wasn't the first time people had told me racism is ignorant and hateful and stupid. It was the first time that a community of people who I knew and respected and
Mm.
felt like I wanted to defend and protect were saying that about me. And so the conflict in me was, I need to lean into this in some way. I don't want to run away. And I also don't want to just be this person who's dismissing this.
Mhm. I know that there were people on the message board that said, some people said, well, let's get him out of here. Let's make the university kick him out. Let's ostracize him. Let's demonize him. Nobody talk to him. Let's ignore him. And then on the other side, you had some people reached out to you, or because you had met them in your first semesters, Allison and Matthew, and they reached out to you. And then can you just tell us how they were able to help you kind of think through some of your beliefs? And as we discussed briefly on Friday, that this came from a place of kindness and patience and caring, not of confrontation, and ostracism, and condemnation. And how did their approach play a role? How did that affect you and allow you to actually come around and really think through and question what you've been believing for 20 years?
Right. This is something that did really take me, for initially the first few years after this college. Like you said at the beginning, this is sort of like reading about the Titanic. At the end of it, I'm going to condemn this world and leave it. But like the drama is, what happens in between, and how did that happen, and how did I think about it? And at the time, I really felt deeply resentful of the people who were in the camp of, ostracize this person. We are not going to make a home or a space. Like, Derek should not come back to this school. And at the time I felt like, oh, this is hostile and this is counterproductive and none of these people don't know me, all this sort of like defensive stuff. But I look back on it when I was reading all these old emails and looking at these archives and writing this book. And I recognized just how essential all of that was, and also how much more nuanced it was. In the first few hours after that thread happened, there were basically the three camps that defined my life for the next few years afterwards. And the first one was, like you mentioned, this idea that we do not prioritize white supremacists or somebody who is anti-Semitic. We are going to prioritize the people who feel alienated and who feel unsafe on this campus, knowing that a representative of this movement is here, and that is our value and that is our priority. And whether you advocate for me to be expelled in some way, which wasn't a successful campaign, there wasn't a grounds for it, or if you just passively ignore me and give me middle fingers and try to make me feel uncomfortable, like that was a strategy that felt horrible. And I look back on as like the straightforward response to somebody who's advocating hate in your community, somebody who's advocating devaluing things. And then also, as you mentioned, the other camp were people who thought, this person grew up in this movement. This person is a member of our community. And also, so many people knew me personally. I had made an impression. People knew that I was passive and kind and could be a good friend and had been friends with lots of people who were not white and had dated a Jewish person on campus. And there was this sort of like conflict of like, I never heard the word hypocrisy, but I feel like in retrospect, I'm surprised there wasn't more of that. But there was at least this sense that New College is a place that people are rapidly and dramatically changed in their beliefs, and maybe this will happen to Derek Black too. And I watched those threads, and I also thought that's ridiculous. Like, I am, what are you going to argue me out of something that it's just true? What are you going to do? I can't help you. It's my worldview is accurate because I had shown up to college thinking that I wasn't closed-minded. I thought, oh, I'm open to facts. If I'm wrong about something, I want to know it. But unfortunately, I'm right about everything. I've like thought it all through rigorously, and I've been debating people my whole life, and you just don't understand it. But it was that last part that was the conflict for me that made me feel like I need to lean in here, because this was a community that knew me. It felt pretty rapidly like the way that I dismissed these sort of arguments that what I was advocating in the world was just unbelievably dehumanizing and awful. I could rationalize and say, no, it's just about uh, facts and immigration and statistics and all this sort of like stuff that felt a little bit more detached from the dehumanizing rhetoric of this movement that is legitimately violent and terrifying. And I could sort of keep myself feeling like I was consistent with my values of being close to people, but not here. Because when I said they don't understand me or they don't know me or they're misunderstanding how I am, it wasn't true. They did know me. They knew that I could be a good friend. And so their explanation had to be that I was deceptive or naive or ignorant or not willing to look at pretty obvious facts as they saw them. And so when I got back to that campus, I was invited to one of the few social functions that I got invited to was a student named Matthew who organized Shabbat dinners in his dorm, weekly observant Jewish dinners to begin the Sabbath. And I knew him, he knew me, which I think is also important context. It wasn't a stranger reaching out. We had shared a study guide. We had some common friends, even though we hadn't been super close that first semester. And so I went thinking that they were going to debate me or something, try to at least ask me about my beliefs. And I thought, oh, I've talked to journalists my whole life. I can explain my beliefs if they do that. But instead, I found out afterwards he had told the other people at the dinner, don't challenge Derek about this. Don't bring it up. The point is just to be here for now. We want Derek to come back. And what I experienced was instead a dinner where my avoidance didn't even get challenged. And we talked about religion and campus gossip and life. And we were close and we were friends, and I didn't get put on the defensive, at least at first, and I started coming back week by week.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And then so they started challenging some of your beliefs fact-wise, right? So that's, I think it was Allison, Matthew, and others were giving you articles that show that some of the facts that you thought were true were actually not true at all. And so there was some factual dismembering essentially of your belief system, as well as on the emotional side, what you just talked about a little bit more. So
Mhm.
so like both are kind of moving in parallel in the same direction, away from white nationalism. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the next step. I think it's when I try to tell the story, I try to think about it in like what is the takeaway. I always like trying to like understand what are the generalized lessons of my personal experience. I'm far enough away from it that I do think there's a lot of things that are general and true, and part of it is showing up to a space and not feeling immediately on my back foot. I'm feeling like, okay, I feel like I actually we're friends here, and I need to sit with the conflict of I had abandoned anti-Semitism at that point, even though I had believed it as a teenager. It was one of the earlier planks that I just felt like I could not tolerate. Racism and all these arguments for race still lingered, and thought it was this factual thing, but anti-Semitism was something that I think it's probably important for the context of going to the dinners. I thought, well, maybe I can be a white nationalist who is just not anti-Semitic. And so I had showed up those spaces and had to sit with the conflict of like representing a movement that was deeply anti-Semitic. And many of the people at the dinners were not white. And I was representing a movement that was deeply inhuman to anyone who it saw as not white. And so initially I was just attending those things. And like I mentioned, Allison was one of Matthew's roommates who, for the first few weeks, months actually, join the group of people who I had seen on the forum who took the position of, don't acknowledge me, don't give me a space, don't try to make me feel welcomed. And she was white and she was not Jewish. And she felt like her responsibility was to show her disdain for this worldview that was making people that she was very close to feel unsafe, uncomfortable, really unnerved in their own community. And so for the first few months, she did not attend. And then eventually after I kept coming, she sat down one day and said, like, I'm not going to not come to these dinners, these nice home cooked meals in my dorm with my friends. And initially didn't really talk to me still, but recognized that I was at least acting in a way that seemed kind of contradictory to being a representative of this movement that was so exclusionary and racist. And her initial outreach there was to think, realizing nobody was talking to me explicitly about it on campus. It was something that people debated on the forum. It was something that people made clear that I was not welcomed in a lot of spaces, but that some people would ask me in one-off conversations, could you explain this worldview? And then they would be a little bit taken aback that I thought I didn't harm anybody or was not being hateful, and they would just be baffled, and we would sort of retreat. Allison decided she felt safe. Her identity wasn't under fire from this ideology, and she reached out to me asking, just, could we have a conversation where you explain what it is you believe and how it is that you sort of square these two things, the fact that you come to these Shabbat dinners and you're friends with people on campus who seem very, very contradictory to this ideology that you represent. Like, could you explain what you believe, why you believe it, in private, without trying to score points, without thinking she was gonna go post it on the forum or catch me saying something ridiculous and try to embarrass me. And I always said yes when people asked me that, but in that space, it turned out trying to actually explain it to somebody in not one conversation, but another conversation, while she came back and realizing that I believed my worldview was based on facts, came back saying, sure, do you mind if I give you studies and we sort of argue about this? It began this next couple of years of these conversations where we agreed. I took the position that, like, could we do every 5 conversations can be you trying to like argue me out of my worldview, and then the others we can talk about books and music and sports and just kind of be friends.
Mm.
And then what preceded was the next couple of years of always debating one piece of evidence and feeling like, I could lose one piece of evidence because the justification for racism is false if you're willing to look at it. Like, race is it's just a social idea. It's not something that exists in biology or genetics. And it's not predictive of people's behavior or anything really about them beyond the social milieu they're born into. And so accepting those things didn't feel like it was undermining my worldview, but bit by bit, I felt like I was losing my ideological toolbox. And I was becoming increasingly uncomfortable realizing that I represented something to this movement. And I didn't want to lose all the relationships in my life or to betray them, to leave this community that looked to me as the future. But I was slowly resolving that I don't believe this, and I think there's no misunderstanding. This is harming people who I deeply care about and do not want to be someone who is harming them. And this is something that also created a lot of ambiguity that I try to sit with in the book, about the fact that it wasn't, at least for me, enough to realize that my ideology didn't have facts to support it. It really was as harmful as people had initially tried to tell me and I tried to deny. And yet, even at that point, I had realized that it was losing the community and the identity and the feeling of safety that was holding me there. And it was just like another kind of intolerable sort of tension that I had to resolve in some way.
And after some encouragement from Allison, you decided to write a letter to the Southern Poverty Law Center, as you wanted to have them publish it. So the new Derek, having denounced all of your old white nationalist views, would be publicly known. And I wondered, can you tell us, how did it feel? So once you wrote this, I know you took some time writing it and rewriting it, and weren't sure how to do it, but finally, settled on a version of it. And when you sent it off to the SPLC, what did that feel like? Were you sitting on pins and needles, wondering what's going to happen next? And I want to make sure our viewers understand that your disavowing these views wasn't just a religious conversion. It was really a matter of that, plus your family members were all deeply embedded in the movement. All of your NCF friends were all white nationalists. All your social ties, your whole world was that, other than NCF. And so you were taking a step away from everything up until maybe when you were age 20 or something. And so it's a huge, almost unfathomable change to make. So how did it feel like to you when you sent this letter off and we're
Yeah.
expecting this to become public knowledge now, and your family would find out about it and so forth? What was that like?
I mean, it felt like walking into a void. Like, I think at this point in my life, I think sometimes people look at it and say, like, oh, you left this fringy movement and joined the world. And some of the relationships I have now are some that I could never possibly imagine. I find a lot of meaning in myself being aligned with my values and the community that I've very slowly built, person by person over the last decade. But at the time, it didn't feel like leaving a community to just join something else. Even New College was not a space that I felt like I expected any kind of welcome. And it's not really one that I did feel a sort of welcome. It was this space that it caused a lot of trauma and heartache. And it felt like the only moral choice. I had gotten to this place where I believed that this ideology I was raised in was wrong factually and wrong morally. And I wanted almost more than anything to just stop talking about it, to stop being such a public figure, to stop. And I had withdrawn, I had stopped hosting this radio show that my dad and I had co-founded on AM and run for years. I had stopped posting. I hadn't posted it on his website in a year and a half. I had withdrawn in ways that my family could see and knew that I was trying to distance myself from the ideology, but they didn't recognize, because I hadn't talked to them about the amount that I had really reconceptualized it as something actively caustic and harming the world around us. And so I got to this place where I just wanted to be silent. I wanted to not talk about it. And it felt terrible to realize that I thought this was not only incorrect and just false, but also harmful to people I cared about. And wanting to be silent felt like just this immoral decision. So I had to look at it and recognize the reason is because I don't want to lose every relationship I've formed in my life. And it was that was the point I had to recognize that I had always seen myself as somebody who was motivated by facts and reasoning and not by trying to please my parents or my community, not by just being raised in something. I'd worked hard to see myself that way, and recognizing that the role of this ideology was to connect me to my community, to give me this sense of who I was in relation to them. And that just felt like shaking who I was even again beyond just it had been easy to leave these facts behind in retrospect. They had felt like very intense conversations at the time. But compared to the idea of making a statement, making a change, declaring that I am not an advocate for white nationalism, I advocate anti-racism, that moment meant losing all the people. And with it, it felt like losing me. It felt like I did not know who I was, and I didn't know, and it felt like I didn't see that there was ever going to be a space where I could feel at home, where I could feel comfortable, where I could feel cared about. And it just felt like there's just no other decision to make. And I think that's something that I really try to emphasize, that we talk about changing your mind, and I think that phrase doesn't carry the weight that it really should, particularly when we're talking about something that's deeply held in our beliefs, or something that's tied to how we see ourselves. And I think my lesson from that was so hard in the moment, is that these beliefs and values, and or not necessarily values, I think my values stayed the same. It's this worldview, this sense of ideology, and how do I see things, almost always, maybe arguably always, functions as a way to connect us to the community of people we care about. And so the real lesson that I've taken from it is that the idea of changing your mind, the idea of being persuaded, is exactly the same thing as changing your community, changing the relationships and the people, the constellation of people that you care about, that you consider yourself responsible for, the loyal to, the people that you love. And I think when we think about it that way, we can recognize why it's so rare and why it's so hard, and why it feels like a death almost, and sort of recognize that it is incredibly challenging. And at the same time, thinking about changing your mind, persuasion as changing your community, we can also recognize that it happens all the time. It's a very common human experience, but that doesn't mean that it's one that is easy.
Right, and most of the time, it's actually not going to be anywhere near as dramatic as what happened in your case.
Mhm.
We all do change our minds about this issue or that issue, and most of the time, it's pretty simple to do that. I actually study persuasion; that's one of my areas of expertise, and so persuasion can sometimes be very simple and small, and other times can be
Mhm.
really, really large. And I think that in your case, not many of us have gone through that kind of transformation, yeah, that level. So. Um, and I think we do sometimes forget about how enmeshed our belief systems are in our actual lives, day-to-day lives, and how much those have dictated to us, for us, what we were going to believe. I talk to my students about how cults work, and we talk about vulnerability to cults. And initially in this class, I teach students don't think they're vulnerable. Hey, that person's in a cult. Who joins a cult? I would never do that, and so on. But by the time the course is over, they realize that actually, yes, any of us are susceptible to being in a cult, because you don't know you're joining a cult, right? You start off in small steps, and eventually you're in the middle of it and you don't even realize you're there. It's not going to happen to any of us. And in a parallel case for you, you were born into this system that you had no way of seeing beyond. And so how could you not develop these beliefs early on and adapt them, adopt them, and so forth, especially given the role that your father and your godfather played in the movements. Um, if I could, I want to veer away from your personal story for a few minutes. We'll come back to it in a little bit, but I want to ask you about the white nationalist movement itself. And we brought up anti-Semitism a few minutes ago. I just wanted to focus on that for a moment. As you know, we had a panel last week looking at how we can confront anti-Semitism in our local community. And so this issue is very much on our minds here in Reading. And my question to you is, why is anti-Semitism so central to the white nationalist movement? So I know there are a lot of anti-immigrant sentiments, anti-Black, anti-Latino, and so on, but anti-Semitism is different than those though in a lot of ways. One of the ways it's different is that people who are Jewish are seen as being evil. They're just evil people and should not exist, which is different than saying, okay, you're Black, go to Africa and live there, or develop another nation while we can have a white ethno nation here on this continent. It's a different approach. It's saying you should not exist versus you should be someplace else and separate from me. And as you know, white nationalism has increased in recent years, as has anti-Semitism. We've seen a huge increase in various acts, bomb threats, and shootings and so forth, all over the place. And for you, what separates anti-Semitism from these other isms in a sense, and why is it so central to the white nationalist movement in this country?
Right. I mean, I think I almost look at that. I have two quick reactions to like how anti-Semitism functions differently from other forms of racism, and I think I also emphasize that anti-Semitism does function as a form of racism. It's not necessarily a different category, but the ways that it operates is like racism tends to function as this inferiority. These people who are worse than you, they have to exist somewhere else because you're better than they are. And anti-Semitism functions in this conspiratorial way where white nationalists think that Jews are smarter than they are and are more strategic and thoughtful and are operating this global conspiracy and always one step ahead of them. And it functions in this way where both of them are just ideas of people, dehumanizing ideas that are essentializing and believe that people's birth and their biology and their ideologies and whatever are just like inherent and unchangeable, and it's a very rigid worldview. But anti-Semitism, if you ask the white nationalists, they wouldn't explain it in a sociological way. They would say, like, oh, they just legitimately believe that every Jewish person is a part of this global conspiracy to enact anti-racist policies, that the anti-racist movement has not been actually forwarded by people of color, that it's Jewish people who have orchestrated it. And if there were no Jewish people, then there'd be no anti-racist movement. And like that is their worldview. And so that would be their answer. And so I look back on it, and my explanation is that anti-Semitism is the thread that makes it work, especially as a global movement, because white nationalism is something that exists not just in America and not just in any one part of America, but it's something that is deeply tied into European politics, into Australian politics, South Africa, South America. Like this is a movement that sees itself as deeply international and has these global expectations for revolution and overthrowing governments and creating this like racial Nazi states segregating people all around the world, and they see themselves that way. And yet race is this idea that does not function in the same way at all. Not, I mean, even in different regions of one country, it does. Race is something that's deeply fluid. It's a social idea that's constantly changing. You can even emphasize that the idea of whiteness has changed constantly in the history of North America. And even in the 19th century, Italians and Irish people were not classified as white, and yet that's sort of laughable to 21st century people. But anti-Semitism is this idea that somehow functions transnationally. It's something that allows white nationalists to lean on this idea of this conspiratorial, shadowy explanation for why the world is the way it is, and almost look away from the contradictions of other forms of racism, like almost look away from the fact that race is indefinable. Like white nationalists, I remember people talking about this, the sort of problem of how are you going to define white people in this future nation. And when leaders were sitting around in private discussing, they recognized that there's no line between the races. I remember one guy making a thought experiment where he said, if you walked from France to India, you would never cross the line where white people stopped. And so I'm not, how are we going to do this? And their system was they were going to create a panel of people who had been vetted as white. And those people were going to look at every person thinking about immigrating, and they were going to assess it. And if enough of them said, yeah, that person seems white to me, then that would be the definition of white. And for a movement that was so baked into the idea that race defined people, in their moments when they really tried to nail it down, they recognized how illegitimate it was. And so I look at anti-Semitism as this motivating energy in a movement that is inherently irrational. And not to say anti-Semitism is rational, but together they sort of make this ideology and movement that people are able to, I think, hold things together, hold contradictions together that might have fallen apart without each other.
Hmm. Yeah, and one of the scariest things about the white nationalist movement in our country today, as well as anti-Semitism, and again, the two are really overlapping in many ways, is how it's been mainstreamed. And I'm reading a book, actually, you mentioned the global far right. I'm reading this book called Hate in the Homeland, the global reach of the new global far right, I should say. It's by Cynthia Miller Idris. And she talks about the far right all over the world, mostly in the US, but talks about Germany and England and France and some other places as well. And she spent some time talking about the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism. And you
Mm.
discuss this also in your book, that you were involved in helping the movement, the white nationalist movement, change its language. And I think it started before you, but you kind of added on to help mainstream it some more by changing the words, changing how people spoke. And this professor talks about how people dress, and that people stop dressing in, the neo-Nazi bald head and this, the black clothes and all that. The skinheads stopped being a major part of the movement. People started changing how they dress, literally because they wanted to fit in and look more normal, even if their beliefs weren't normal, weren't mainstream. And she talks about rock concerts and weekends away for camping, where people will be recruited to the white nationalist movement that way as well. She talks about food and how white nationalists, at least many of them now, have special diets they want to follow. So these pure diets to fulfill their, because they're all pure-blooded white people, right? So they want to have these pure foods, unadulterated. They grow their own. They're organic. It's kind of a funny thing where the organic thing now has become a right-wing phenomenon, at least in some elements of that, not just a left-wing phenomenon. Clothing, there are companies now that cater to the far right in this country. And even MMA, the mixed martial arts movement, is a breeding ground now, recruitment ground, both here and in Europe, for white nationalists. And so we're seeing this stuff become so mainstream now. And I knew you were sort of in the heart of that for a while. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that process a little bit, and where do you think this is going? I mean, is this going to become even more and more mainstream? Are we going to maybe at some point see a pushback or dissipation of this, or what are your thoughts?
Right. I mean, I don't. So they often have these visions of global revolutions. Like their visions are massive. I think when I was sitting among leaders and trying to plot this future for white nationalism when I was a teenager and deeply believed in and committed to it, the worldview that everybody saw was one where the government of the United States is essentially overthrown, if not in its structure, then just in the ideology that it perpetuated. Like their beliefs are apocalyptic, really. Like they view this world that is just heading to an unrecognizable place. And I look at that and I think that's implausible, in fact, but that there is seeds that kind of make sense there, that the way they really function is by amplifying beliefs that are not alien to our society. Like the way that they are powerful is because they have spent decades knowing that their role is to be the only people in the room who are willing to weather being called racist or white supremacists or Nazis, and to still maintain their movement, to still maintain their groups and their social scene. And they see themselves as like self-sacrificing. They view themselves as being the recipients of all of these insults and social stigma and potentially getting fired or outed, and just being often pariahs in society. And they think the reason they're doing that is because millions of people have more low-key versions of the racism and anti-Semitism that they are propagating, and they're not fully wrong in that. These are beliefs that are built into our society through actual colonialism, centuries of American history. It's not that bigotry came first, it's that we created, or that people generations before us created structures that separated people and created this category of race, and then justifications for it followed that. And the result is that racism is not a alien, strange idea that only exists on the fringe. And so by amplifying that, they create a lot of power by giving people who are feeling defensive, people who are feeling on the back foot themselves, who are feeling like they don't have a space where they can say their judgments or their prejudices without getting called out or accused of racism. They can find a home within this movement, or they can just find some kind of resonance within this movement. And there's a lot of political power there. Like that's how they have won campaigns. That's how they have created a massive social movement sometimes in campaigns they didn't win. And I think that that's really where the danger that I see lies. It's in the idea that I believe they can, in fact, win elections. That's not a belief that's really changed from when I was in the midst of it or now. Just my fear of that happening is what has changed. And I also believe that there's a lot of destruction to society that they can create as a result of that. It's not that they have millions of members who are going to create a revolution. It's that they can tap into beliefs that are so much more common than people have often given them credit for, and use that to really create terror, really create a sort of society that could be unrecognizable, if not in the same way that they hope, in ways that a lot of us don't want to see, to put it really lightly. And I think that's really where the danger. One thing that I kind of emphasize is how white nationalists are deeply militant, deeply revolutionary at heart, even when they advocate politics. And that's something that I think we've seen the right really in America embracing in ways that I think is very alarming. And I try to draw attention to that. I was in Washington, D.C. in 2020 for the George Floyd protests, and Donald Trump had called up security people from different federal divisions, and he had deputized police. And so he had people in the streets from Bureau of Prisons and immigration enforcement, many of them without really clear identification as to who they were, carrying weapons and just sort of being the heavy for the president and intimidating protesters. He buzzed crowds with helicopters in this way that is considered a war crime and sort of terrifying people. And then we saw January 6th. And I think that sort of confluence about how similar January 6th looked to Charlottesville in the direct violence and the fighting that you could see is something that I don't really see where the guardrails are for political parties or political candidates in America to sort of embrace that far right vision of a militant, maybe even like militia sort of politics. And then winning office, they can use the might of the actual state for as their own private armies. We've seen it in little tiny ways, and it's the vision for the future that I think is feeling the most pressingly dangerous to me from the far right and the way that it's sort of enacting itself in the world right now.
Yeah, and we're seeing that more and more in the candidacy of Donald Trump. So he's embracing the language of the Nazis in ways that he wouldn't have done 4 years ago or 6 years ago. And again, it's helping to mainstream so many of these ideas. He used the term the United Reich in a tweet a couple days ago. And to what extent do you think his anti-Semitic vitriol is just overall anger and I don't want to say disgust with so many of his fellow Americans is based in anti-Semitism? Do you think it's a conscious thing for him and people
Mm.
who are around him? Do you think it's just because it's opportunistic? He knows that he will get his people to clap for him if he says certain kinds of things. How deep, in your opinion, does this anti-Semitic thread run in the MAGA movement at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I can't answer the question of him personally. It's always been mildly
Yeah.
mysterious to me. There was a time, in 2016 when I felt sometimes confident because he was so clearly not into white nationalism. Like, it didn't even seem like he understood that it was a movement. Like, he understood that talking points out of white nationalism were effective sometimes in populist politics, but it seemed like you have plenty of quotes from him in the early 2000s, denouncing the Nazis and Pat Buchanan and David Duke. And he recognized that there was something powerful in the politics they did, but he seemed very clearly to not consider himself like them in any way, just maybe sort of treading on the same politics that they were and trying to be very effective at using it in ways that he thought was probably smarter and more intuitive than they had in their ideology. He just wasn't a rigid ideologue, and I don't think he is now. But I can answer the fact that this is an ideology that white nationalism itself can be relatively limited in its numbers. It's something that is, I have a lot of trouble even imagining it becoming a massive movement, but it is very significant in the sort of ideological threads, because as the only people who were willing to maintain explicit racism over the decades, they also developed ways to talk about racism in ways that could be palatable to millions of people. And so as a result of that, it has become much more central. A lot of aspects of white nationalist worldview have become much more central to sort of mainstream right politics in America than they ever have been in my lifetime. And so the fact that anti-Semitism is becoming so much more common and central in a party that, 15 years ago seemed like it pretty roundly denounced anti-Semitism, seemed like it was an alien entity within it in ways that maybe racism were sometimes a little bit more accepted, particularly if it was anti-immigration. I think the result of embracing the toxicity and the effectiveness of far right racism is that all the guardrails sort of fall away, and that any of these prejudices become very central, that there's no real way to embrace some of it but not let all of it slowly become who you are.
Right, right. And it's kind of a bit by bit process. And so all of a sudden we're, the whole, the paradigm of the frog in the bottle and the boiling water, right, doesn't realize how hot it's getting until it's too late. And you see the same thing happening, some would argue, in the United States today regarding the far right, anti-Semitism, and so forth. So let me go to a couple of questions from our audience, and I'll come back to, I've got another one for you in a little bit here. So one member is asking, have you ever mentored anyone leaving the movement, or have you actively tried to reach out to anyone to get them to leave the movement?
When I condemned white nationalism, I lost all the relationships and did not try to maintain any of the relationships within white nationalism, except for my family. And I've talked to my parents. We've had the ability to communicate for this decade, and it's unusual. It's uncommon. We text on holidays and birthdays, and when there's some kind of family news, we have been able to do calls every now and then. I visited them a few times over the last decade, and their ideology hasn't budged at all, as far as I know. I think in most ways it's become more extreme as they felt validated by a lot of mainstream politics seeming to embrace things that used to be consigned to just them and their fringe beliefs. I've never mentored anybody, and that's not really a space that I see myself, but I have heard of white nationalists who have left the community who then said that hearing things I said and the ways I explained it was helpful in that process. But I think in general, I sort of don't necessarily think just intervening in somebody's life. I think the lesson that I took from my experience is that, I can be a person who is personal and a specific person in the lives of my family, and also not deeply influence them, because I think it also requires a community. I think it also requires that they see themselves as being, that whoever we're talking about sees themselves as being a part of a context that requires that they sort of evaluate themselves. They think they're fully right. One person talking to you can be very important, and especially if they're an important person. But I think that it's just not how our worldviews work. Like, our worldviews are so tied to our community. And for my parents, their community is white nationalism. And for most white nationalists, that remains as sort of the point. And that's the way that it functions, kind of like I don't know, like a religion or something. It's like their community and their beliefs are so deeply tied together that they would need to experience finding themselves in a different space among a different community to sort of have that impetus in the same way. I think that's something from my life view, my life story, that I think is, if not universal, then extremely basic to how persuasion works. And so I don't, I guess I don't want to advocate responsibility to talk to people, but I think that my lesson to myself and other people is that the main thing that we can do is sort of speak out against the wrongs that we see in society. Like that is the main thing that people at my college did. And it's the main thing that we can do in our day-to-day lives when we see things in our communities or anywhere around us that we touch with our lives, leaning into our values to, at the very least, condemn it, but also try to change it is a deeply impactful, important thing. And I think that that's the role that I more often find myself in. And I think it's also the role that most people kind of find themselves in. Most people at my college were not sitting in a dorm, that I was coming to weekly. And the choices that they made were, in retrospect, deeply ethical. They were saying that they condemned racism and anti-Semitism, and they didn't want anybody who was a victim of it in their lives to feel uncomfortable in their community. And then that meant condemning me. And that was the impetus for me to lean into the spaces where I was talking to people individually. I think there's a pretty deep lesson there that we all play different roles, and being somebody who speaks out for your values can be essential, can be the foundation for anybody changing their mind in some space that you don't even necessarily always know about.
Mhm. So you mentioned NCF again. One of our one of our audience members is asking this question. So where do you think you'd be if Matt had never invited you to the Shabbat dinners?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it's kind of impossible to go back and figure that out exactly. We never know what causes what to happen, but can you speculate as to how central of a role did that particular invitation or
Yeah.
series of invitations play in your transformation?
That's interesting. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that specifically. Interestingly, I think the question that I've thought about a lot is, had I gone to a bigger university or never gone to college at all, what would that have been like? And my answer to that is that I suspect I would have found my way out of it in some way, but I think it would have involved a lot more hemming and hawing, and it wouldn't have happened at that time, and I wouldn't have felt so morally obligated to examine myself and my beliefs in the way that I was, because even at that point I hated the alienation that I caused for people I just didn't want to be harming. I saw myself as somebody who wanted to be open to people, and why nationalism just is not. It's based in separating people, and that was something that was always a major tension that I spent a lot of time rationalizing. And so it's interesting. If I'd been at New College and condemned by the community and had the experience already where I had gotten so close to people who felt betrayed by the fact that I kept so much from them, but then I had never had the experience of sitting in a smaller private space where where Matthew invited me in, and where Allison was saying, let's sort of talk about these things in private. I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. Like, maybe had I gotten to that point, maybe I can never say a counterfactual with any kind of confidence, but it feels like, having just sat with the community condemning me, but I knew I cared about and respected them, should have led to something. I think I look back, even while I was doing the book, I think I know I'm like processing this in real time, because actually I haven't had the specific question. And a lot of questions I've had before, it's not that I just give you a churn to answer, but some of them I've thought about, and this one not specifically. And I thought about it when I was
Keep on
writing
your
the book,
toes.
where I was like looking back at myself because I got frustrated with myself a lot. I was like, how in the world are you so like dense that you can't just accept this stuff, past me? And I sort of look back on it, and I think it was that moment of coming back to the community, choosing to come back to the community because I knew them and respected them, and wouldn't respect myself if I ran away from it. I would not be able to just say, oh, they were wrong, they were dumb. I knew there was something about it where I need to understand if there's any way to explain myself or find the misunderstanding. I showed up back on campus with that belief. And I think that is my retrospective. That was the moment when my ability to continue being the heir to white nationalism had gotten degraded to a point where it wasn't going to work anymore, because I had that moment of saying, I don't know that I can resolve these two things, because I care about these people and I can't explain myself to them. So maybe I can't explain myself to myself.
Mhm.
But had I not gotten the outreach, all the stuff where I was justifying it with facts would have been so much harder to undermine. Like, that was the thing that took someone else to walk with me, essentially, because that required that I rethink, what do I consider evidence? Who do I trust? Like, how do I get over the confirmation bias that by definition, we don't know is happening at the time. We think, oh, I have facts to justify whatever it is I believe. And it's very, very hard to see how selective we're being. And we're all always being selective. Sometimes it's not quite as high stakes as you're a white nationalist, but confirmation bias is something that exists in all of us, and it's impossible to, or not impossible, very challenging to identify it ourselves. And so I think it would have required that I find another space, a community somewhere, if not a new college somewhere, where I could sort of sit with those tensions and lean into somebody else trusting me in that way. And I think I probably could have found it, but I think it would have been, like every other version of my life, harder had I not had the people who were making these sacrifices for me.
Yeah, and very few of us would go out and actually try to undermine our own beliefs. And so for somebody to think, well, why didn't Derek do this on their own, doesn't really make that much sense. And because most of us don't do that. We even, you're on the left, you're on the right, wherever you are, we look for things that support what we think, as you were saying before, the confirmation bias. And very few of us go out and actually try to undermine, seriously question our own beliefs. And so it makes complete sense that it requires somebody else who you would listen to help you do that.
Mhm.
Somebody who was saying, let's get him out of here, ostracize, whatever. It sent you articles, you might have ignored those articles, but having people who you cared about give those articles to you, I'm sure made a world difference in your receptivity to reading those and taking those through.
Yeah, there's only one other comment I would make that's sort of coming to my mind, which is there were some other people at the college who affected me, like in ways that I don't think they always made it even into the book because it's sort of hard to quantify. Something I think about is like a one-off conversation is really hard to talk about as super momentous. It doesn't feel momentous in the time. It never actually comes. It doesn't snowball into moments, but it's influential on its own and it leads to other things. And there were some people who sent me messages that were trying very intentionally to show that they had thought about what it is I believe from my perspective. Like there were some people at New College who, as teenagers, had leaned into white nationalism, had sort of like found it and thought, oh, this feels good, this justifies and explains something, and that had then realized, oh, wait, what am I doing here? This is, and then had stopped being a 15-year-old and leaned out of it, but could then send me an email and say like, yeah, I'm familiar with Stormfront. As a 15-year-old, I sort of dabbled in it. I thought about it. I leaned into it. I had this experience. Like they're like a white dude who, recognized that racism had this appeal to them that they are horrified in retrospect, but that they could then say, I understand what it is you believe, and here's me proving it. And I think that's not to say that those people, that's enough, like a one-off, like let me say it to you, but I think there is something inherent there about the fact that the person who is reaching out to you, they can't just be like, oh, that's wrong. They also have to be doing the amount of work to show that oh yeah, I get your beliefs and I don't believe them. Like that sort of contradiction. It's like the amplified version of what I was experiencing with this community that was horrified by what I believed and I cared about them. That was a kind of dissonance. But the more extreme version of that is somebody you care about who really understands you, can explain it back to you because you've explained it to them, and you can say, yeah, that's right. And then they can say, yeah, and it's awful. I think it's wrong. I think it's morally wrong. And like that was the super intense thing that happens in an individual relationship. So, maybe I'm just reiterating it, but it's just another way that it requires this intervention from another person because ideas are communal, like ideas are social. It's not something that we just I don't think we come to them for the first time alone, and I don't think we change them alone. We change them because of our relationships. Even the most stoic individual person who values autonomy makes the beliefs and the changes in their life because of relationships in some way.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a parallel here between your relationship with Allison and Matthew and maybe some others, and how a person might interact with their therapist. And that is to say that
Sure.
here's somebody who's an objective, sort of objective person in a way, who you start trusting, presumably as a client of a therapist, and then that person can sort of get you to start looking at your belief system in a different way without you thinking they're out to get you or they're just have their own secret agenda. And so I could see kind of a parallel there where this trust has to be there first, a foundation,
Mhm.
and that can then lead to some pretty fundamental changes if given interactions that pursue are following up to that initial trusting relationship.
Yeah, a feeling of safety that comes from trust.
Yeah. Safety as well. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go back to your personal journey in a different sense. So you don't talk about this very much in in your book, but you do briefly in your epilogue. I think you know where I'm going with this question already.
Mm.
And I wonder if you could share with us. I think we have a lot of people who'd be interested in hearing about your personal exploration of your gender identity and gender expression. You state in your book that you felt like you could be placed under the umbrella of trans at New College of Florida, and you've now changed the pronouns that you prefer. Um, so a question about that. How did that kind of happen over time, and what led you down that pathway to discover who you are?
Mhm.
And what role did this questioning of your gender identity have in questioning the whole white nationalist movement? You mentioned earlier that you may have gone this way anyway had you not had a couple of friends at New College of Florida. So maybe it would have taken you longer. But I wonder if there's some parallel process here where questioning something else very fundamental about yourself would have led also to questioning other beliefs. Because, as you know, the white nationalist movement is this bastion of hyper masculinity, toxic masculinity. And what you're talking about is you're breaking away from that as well in your own personal, life. So, can you just talk about those kind of two things for a few minutes, please?
Yeah, for sure. It's sort of funny because, like, at this point, I'm quite happy to talk about gender, but it's funny, like, when I was writing the book over the last few years, really, I thought about it for like the last 7 or 8 years, but I was writing it pretty intensely up until about 7 months ago. And all through that period, I was like, oh, I can't even imagine discussing it. I think even talk to friends now where I'm like, they look at interviews where I'm talking about my own experience with gender and my thoughts about gender, and they're like, 3 months ago, you were talking about how you couldn't imagine talking about this. And I'm like, I know, it's crazy, right? And so it's felt nice to get to a place where, like, I feel not like I've done everything or thought everything I'm going to think, but that I feel really good about being more open about it. And so it's like gender has been something that has been a really a part of my life for as long as I can remember. But I think that there's a real aspect to that that I I, I sometimes sort of find it odd to think that, like, trans thoughts are like a small minority of the population. Because I remember when I was a kid, I came to this conclusion that, oh, everybody is deeply uncomfortable with the gender that they are being asked to present, but they just, accept this mandate, and they dress how they're told to dress based on, like, whatever they're being told to present as. They sort of, like, grudgingly take on the roles that they're supposed to take on as just part of living in a society. And that's not just from growing up in white nationalism. It was also just growing up in supposedly liberal Florida. I was a gender expansive kid. I wanted to grow my hair long, mostly for gender reasons. And when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, I constantly taken as a girl and get sort of kicked out of men's bathrooms. Like, bathrooms were deeply uncomfortable for me, and could barely even go into public ones because my options were to say, "Oh no, I'm a boy," and I legitimately got queer slurs thrown at me when I was like 8 years old, and so that was terrifying from adults. Or to not say anything, and then I'd have, like, adult men, like, being weirdly sexist and, like, complimenting my looks or something. It was this thing that stuck with me and always made me very sympathetic to women's experiences and misogyny and sexism. But it really took getting to a community where I could recognize that we do not have to fulfill any particular roles. And also, most people aren't quite as uncomfortable in the roles that they're being asked to fulfill as some people are. And I think that was somewhat shocking to me. It was, like, a little strange to recognize that, because on some level it seemed like it was kind of obvious people weren't, but I just assume everybody's just not talking about it, like I wasn't talking about it, because we've all been told that it's deeply stigmatized and you're going to be shamed for it, so don't discuss it. And so it was really, like, not at New College where I accepted transness, but it was New College where I recognized that it wasn't shameful. It was something that you can choose how you're going to live, and also there's nobody who can tell you what your gender experience or how you're going to live in the world or who you're going to be. Like even sex, we talk about like sex is this like biological thing, which is not the same as race at all. But there is this sense of whenever you have a category that has so many social rules around it, and anybody starts acting like it is a completely rigidly formed barrier, and anybody in this biological category has to fulfill a bunch of social roles and expectations. The lesson from whenever anyone's doing that, there is a power structure happening. There is some kind of social dominant thing happening, and gender is like race in that way, where these social roles and the violence that comes from anybody showing that even biological sex is a very permeable thing is something that New College really helped me recognize. And so when I condemned white nationalism, it wasn't gender that was on my mind. I didn't feel at all safe to come out. I didn't think I wanted to up until 5-6 years ago, where I really started having those thoughts for the first time. Like, I think I want to do something about this in the world, and talking to friends and close people about it for that time. And so I look, but to answer your second question, I am confident that knowing that I had a personal experience that I could not change, that I was not personally ashamed of. I quite liked it about myself. I still like my transness. I think it's something that really makes me feel like who I am, even in something that like lets me see the world in a different way, and it's given me different experiences. But knowing that that was so inherently a part of me, but also something that was the subject of violence and danger and social ostracism and discrimination, and knowing I can't remove that, even though I sort of buried it enough that I forgot the difference between wanting something and not feeling safe to do it. I'm positive that that gave me an aspect of like, it kind of sucks if you discriminate against somebody for some quality of who they are as a person. But it wasn't quite literal enough where I was like, well, clearly I can't be a white nationalist. And I sort of emphasize that this is one of the ways that gender and sexuality is not at all like race. Like there are white supremacist gay people all over, they exist in the world. There's nothing about being a member of a marginalized group or having an aspect of yourself that is the subject of discrimination and stereotyping that means that you have to be an empathetic and compassionate person to other people who are discriminated in some different way. There's no inherent rule about that, and that's definitely not how it sometimes works the other way. People end up leaning into ostracism. And so for me, it was many years after I left white nationalism, most importantly, when I got to a place where I felt kind of confident and safe and like I sort of knew my role in the world in my late 20s, where I suddenly was kind of struck by thinking, this is not something that I feel happy just burying in my mind. This is something that I want to live in the world as. And so it's been really a sort of a long journey that is always ongoing now, about just what are the ways that I want to exist in the world? How do I want to like recognize myself? What kind of communities do I want to exist in? And so that's one of the things that talking about gender and like sex more publicly is making me feel very authentic and open about, because it's something that is not shouldn't ever feel like a secret, even if it is something that is not without consequence. But the main value of it is that it makes me feel very good to be live authentically, but also to be connected to other people who do that too. It's being a part of the trans community, like talking to people and being more open about it, has been one of the more fulfilling parts of my life.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful to hear you say all these things. Just to hear, I could just see on your face there this happiness, this satisfaction, this pride. I'm not sure what the right word is for it, that about who you
I think
were.
joy, actually, that's the one that comes to my mind.
Yeah, who you were, 15, 20 years ago, at least externally, and it's just wonderful to see that. And I appreciate you sharing all that with us and with the rest of the world. One of our audience members asked another question about today's New College. So, as you are well aware, DeSantis has totally changed the culture of New College, changed the administration, changed the board of trustees, and it's a different place, I think, now. I don't know how different personally, because I wasn't there before. I haven't been there since, but it strikes me as a very different place now. And What would happen if Derek Black were to start at NCF this coming fall? What do you think would happen to Derek?
Yeah, it's that is impossible for me to answer, and it's something I've thought about a
I know
lot.
it is impossible,
'Cause,
but
I mean,
it's
to give
sort of
like
fun to think
context
about.
for anybody who's not familiar, and not because I'm familiar with what's happening in the school, it's like it's hard for me to imagine. It's so dramatically different from the experience I actually had. And for context of people, it's like the Ron DeSantis, the far right governor of Florida, filled the board of trustees of the college I went to, which is a public liberal arts college in Florida, with members of the Hillsdale faculty and Christopher Rufo, the far right activist who was very anti-trans and advocated using the phrase like critical race theory to uh, justify not teaching about slavery or the history of racism in schools. And DeSantis announced he wanted to transform this college into this very, more conservative school, make it like the Hillsdale of the South and make it a bastion of the right, and drive out the students. They talked about firing all the faculty. They talked about how they wanted the current students to leave. They created this athletic program in a school that has no facilities for it because they wanted to sort of recruit from private Christian high schools and get more conservative traditional students in a place that was really known as being a place for queer people and weirdos and kids who didn't fit in high school, and this sort of like community of misfits. And they just didn't want people with blue hair and piercings. This was like some of the stuff they said explicitly. And also as a result, it became this international story. And I think that's actually the thing that I most was like, I can't imagine what it would be like if I went there, is not necessarily. It's sometimes hard to see exactly how much has changed, because in practice it is a lot harder to transform a school, an institution, than I think some of these people naively said. They could not fire all the faculty, although a huge number of them have retired early or transferred to other schools. They have done things like fire the librarian who is gay. They have done things like enforce rigid gender rules around bathrooms in a school that had a very high trans population. Now they have a policy that anybody who is found in a bathroom that does not conform to the sex that is on their birth certificate, or they were given on their birth certificate at birth, needs to be reported for student misconduct and is violating the student code. Same for faculty. That the entire state has banned discussion of gender identity in schools. It's not legal for faculty to give their pronouns, or it's this sort of like environment that is so hostile now. But the thing that I like look at is how much I viewed privacy as essential for me and the community when I was there, and that is often lost because this is something that Fox News discusses. Students feel like they can get national profiles by talking about it. Some students who are trying to defend the school feel like they have to become activists on its behalf in public. Some students who feel like they are, what they call mission aligned, feel like they want to be spokespeople for the right. It's this sort of like fight that doesn't take the community's well-being for granted, and instead sort of uses the school as some sort of like tool to make a point. And I think that's the main thing that I think would have been really hard for me to navigate. If we're talking about me and my specific story of being a well-known activist for a cause, the primary first thing the new college gave me was a space that was private, where the community did not forward emails to the press, even when the press reached out because they found out I was there. Like, students defended me, not because they wanted, they believed in my beliefs, but because they thought I was a member of the community and this is something we're going to deal with internally. And so much of that has been lost. And that's one of the things that I'm always really horrified by, along with every other awful change that, the governor has imposed on the school.
Yeah, and we're seeing that elsewhere as well, where kids are being told they can't ask for different pronouns from their teachers, where teachers aren't allowed to use a pronoun different what's written on their record. They can't use nicknames that aren't on their record or are a derivative of their actual name. And so we're seeing that, not quite as extremely as it is in Florida, but where there is this system of just forcing people to be in these very narrow channels. And it's obviously it's the wrong direction for us to be going as a country, as a species, I think, as well, more broadly. Because it's just
I was at a conference for teachers, college and high school teachers in Florida last year, and there was this an anecdote that sticks out in my mind that I couldn't believe because it felt like something that had not been inherently in the laws that had been publicized, but on the ground. I was talking to a bunch of high school drama teachers who say their system now is if they have too many kids of one gender to fill the roles of the gender of the character, they have to ask for permission from their high school administration to do, I forget the term, like it's like cross casting or something, to be able to have a boy play a girl role or a girl play a boy role. And they had to do the same thing for race. If there's a character who is white, to have a black student play that character, that the high school requires that they cast students who match the identity of the characters they're playing, and they have to get this permission from the principal, from the administration, and parents have to be informed of it. And I was just hearing this thing, and they weren't saying it as like, oh, isn't this outrageous? They were casually talking about it as a sort of a headache. It takes a lot of paperwork to have to do all this, and I was hearing it and thinking that this sounds like a foreign regime that is trying to impose some kind of like fundamentalism. This is wild.
Yeah, yeah. So, Derek, I'm really enjoying our conversation tonight. We're running out of time. Unfortunately, I have more questions from the audience. I have more that I've written down. I could spend hours talking to you about some of these issues and topics, and it's just so much fun to hear your perspective on all this stuff. I do have one last question before we conclude. As many of our audience members know, I'm a fan of the Ezra Klein show. Ezra Klein, at the end of his interviews, maybe you know this as well, always asks his guests to list 3 books they recommend that the audience members read to learn more about what the topic is of discussion for that day. But it's late. I'm not going to ask you for 3. I'm going to ask you just for 1. That excluding your own book and Sasla's book about you, is there some other book you'd recommend our audience members read to learn more about? I'm going to give you 2 options actually, either about gender identity, gender expression, so forth, or about white nationalism. If you want to give me one of each, that would be awesome as well.
Interesting. And I'm a big fan of the Ezra Klein show. You would think that I would have like ever thought to say, oh, what would I say if he asked me? But I have not actually, which is fascinating.
I surprised you. That's good.
Yeah. So the white nationalism book, I think I would mostly go to if people want to hear a wide variety of opinions from experts that is really well vetted. And I know most of the historians and academics who are writing essays, and it's a collection of essays called The Field Guide to White Supremacy. And that is it came out a few years ago, so it's still pretty up to date and recent. And it's just remarkable. It has essays from people from different academic specialties talking about it as like a social movement, talking about the ways that paramilitary violence works, talking about recruitment. And it's just, you can read it and have a very good sense of this movement and how it works and how it sees itself from basically all of the experts on white nationalism, white power as an academic subject. So that's an amazing book. The gender book, I think, is an interesting question. It's one where I'm reluctant to give it because I don't know, it's a little older. It's like a book that I don't know, maybe it's a book that only trans people can read or something, and I'm just gonna like give it, which is like the classic.
Tell us what it is.
The classic trans femme book is Whipping Girl by Julia Serrano. And it was like deeply impactful on me. It's like the classic book that tons of people read that is it's a way to sort of rethink femininity and like trans femininity specifically. And it's funny. She writes it as a bunch of little essays and anecdotes, and some of them are weird poetry and stuff. And it's sort of a fun book to read. It was written, I think, in the early 2005 or something. So some of the terminology is not up to date and current. Which is why I maybe give people hesitation. It's like the word transsexual uses transsexual a lot, and like that was a very common word, and now it's not used very much. So I don't want people to be thoughtful about it, but it's a beautiful book and really fundamental to like even understanding these issues. It was impactful for me. And I actually want to give a third book, which is the one that I just like feels off the wall. I mean, not off the wall, but it's not contemporary. It's not like, how do you understand white nationalism? It's not, how do you understand any of these social issues or even persuasion, I guess. But maybe a little bit of all of them, is the book that was deeply impactful to me when I was writing the book. I was thinking about it constantly, was Jean Amarie's book, At the Mind's Limits. Like I quote it a little bit at the end, and he survived the Nazi death camps. He was Jewish. He changed his name to sound more French afterwards to sort of renounce this German identity that he felt like he had been excluded from. And he was an intellectual. He writes in a very philosophical way, but it's just this sort of like thinking about what does it mean for your own society to become unrecognizably horrifying to you, and for the ways that he had gone into and he survived the Holocaust, but he was forever scarred by the fact that he saw people who were just they were normal people. Like, they were not, the people who were staffing these camps were not just some sort of like special breed of human being who's different from everyone else. And he writes about how at first he just imagined they must have empathy too, and he slowly realized that they were able to convince themselves that he wasn't human, that the people in the camps were not human. And he realized that it wasn't special to them, anybody and any person, if they are given the right context and told to be a callous person, theoretically could become that person. And so the book At the Mind's Limits is something that I was just thinking about a lot, about like, what does it mean? What is it about national identity or personal identity or cultural identity that allows people to become something that they wouldn't have recognized themselves at one point in their lives?
Mhm. Those are good suggestions. I'm going to have to check all three of those out. I'll go to bookshop.org tomorrow and order all three of them.
Yeah,
Anyway, so again, thank you, Derek. It's been, I owe you my deep gratitude for having these conversations tonight. I know, again, you're very busy, and not just with the book stuff, but also with your dissertation, which we haven't talked about. But just folks know that Derek to be defending this summer, I think, right? So you're going to finish up and defend it this summer, and so by fall you should do your PhD, right?
Yep. Finally, I ended up supposed to do it last year, and then I ended up taking a year off to do this book. So you get
Yeah,
a book, but
just a
I
little
need to write a
endeavor writing a
dissertation.
book like that. So again, it's been very enjoyable for me. I think for our audience members as well. And I want to thank again the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters. And I'm going to turn over the microphone to Aaron. So Aaron, take it away.
I just want to thank you so much, Derek and Dan, for such an enlightening conversation. It was really interesting. Good luck with defending your thesis. Hopefully, I'm not sure which will be more difficult, writing this book and sharing your story, or defending your thesis. Hopefully, writing the book was the harder part. I have gratitude for the Reading League of Women Voters for partnering with us on this program. And to our viewers, please remember that you can rewatch this or share this event from our YouTube channel after it's up in the next few days. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.